It's Saturday morning and time for a interesting talk, hitting all the issues with Garland Nixon and Brian Berletic. Let's talk. Hello, all. Garland and Brian here on YouTube and Rockfin and stuff like that. So, Brian, let's start. Let's get right to the action. I think we should start with the serious stuff. What I found interesting is real quick intro. You know, I do a regular couple of radio shows, but the one show I do in the evening on WPFW in Washington D.C. And I started talking about Syria, and I went through the U.S. being in there, Trump saying we're there to take the oil, and I went through the documentation that the U.S. is illegally occupying Syria, and then I did the contradictions. I contrasted it with the U.S. saying we recognize the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine, and then the U.S. saying when it comes to the Solomon Islands, 7,341 miles from the U.S. Shores, the U.S. saying we won't rule out military action against the Solomon Islands if they allow China to have a base. And then the Monroe Doctrine. I just showed all of these contradictions that are being borne out by the Ukraine conflict. But let's start with, I have my thoughts on the bombing going on in Syria, but let me get your thoughts on what's happening there.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. Regarding Syria, this has been going on. I think people realize this has been going on for a long time. It started as a proxy war in 2011, and then the United States got involved directly. And then Russia was invited by the recognized government of Syria to intervene. And what they did was the U.S. was saying they were fighting ISIS. Obviously, they weren't. Russia came in, they actually started fighting ISIS, bombing their supply routes coming straight out of NATO territory. And that's what's kind of reined it under control. But the United States is dug in eastern Syria. This is where most of Syria's hydrocarbons come from. And this is where their prime agricultural land is. And I was just looking at this video by Dana Stroll. She's of the U.S. Department of Defense. And she literally said that, you know, this conflict has turned Syria into rubble, and we're there, and we can make sure that it stays rubble. And we can use that as leverage against Syria and Russia to get the outcome we want. So they're occupying eastern Syria specifically to freeze and starve the population, the civilian population, for leverage to get the outcome they want. Again, as you point out, Garland, thousands and thousands of miles away from U.S. territory. And so obviously people have a problem with that. And they carry out these strikes on the illegal U.S. bases there in eastern Syria. And the U.S. does these retaliations. But the problem is the entire geopolitical landscape of the region is now changing. All of these allies or hostages, depending on how you look at it, who were working with the U.S. during this proxy war, one by one, they've started incrementally turning their back on this conflict. They're working more closely with Russia and now even the Syrian government than they are with the U.S. So the U.S. is isolated. They've got these bases in the middle of nowhere, and they make prime targets. And that's what's going on. There's many armed groups in the region operating, backed by the Syrian government, the Iranian government, other groups are operating there. Very hard to tell who actually did this. And they're keeping pressure on the U.S. Military there through military means as the geopolitical pressure, the economic pressure, and all the other pressure continues to mount. So this is something that has to be done despite the U.S. carrying out these retaliations. They claim they were hitting military targets associated with Iranian-backed militias, but who knows? Because they accidentally bombed their own aid workers in Afghanistan, killed a man's entire family, and they lied about it. So we don't know what they are actually bombing. But this is a process that's going to go on until the U.S. eventually is just isolated and then eventually flushed out of the region.
You know, one of the things that I think that's interesting about this on kind of a broad note is the comparison to Ukraine, and that is, you know, the U.S. is an empire and it's fighting proxy wars. If you remember a while back, I think there was one of the WikiLeaks cables that came out where Hillary Clinton said that the destabilization of Syria was done on behalf of Israel. And why was it done on behalf of Israel? She didn't come out and say that, but everybody knows, because Syria is allied with Iran. So even when you look at Syria, the United States is fighting, it has been since 2011, fighting. You could call it a proxy war. You could call it a war of destabilization, a war of terrorism against Syria, right? To destabilize, attack, terrorize Syria, and a war of occupation as a proxy war against Iran. The United States is in Ukraine as a proxy war against Russia. But the interesting thing is, and something I've been talking about, is the contradiction that is borne out by these two proxy wars. The U.S. claims, of course, you know, they're all lies, in Ukraine, hey, we're there because we believe in independence and sovereignty. This is an independent state. It's sovereign. Why they should have the right to do anything they want. Syria, we're going to illegally occupy Syria and not recognize their independence and sovereignty. The world, you know, my dad had a saying, children don't listen, they watch and learn. Now, I'm not comparing the world to children, but I'm applying that analogy to people. If you're in Africa, you're in Asia, you're in Latin America, that's one of the problems that Ukraine has created for the U.S. empire. People are looking at them and the empire is loudly proclaiming independence and sovereignty. That's what it's all about. And the rest of the world says, but you're occupying Syria over here and bombing them and stealing their oil, and you don't recognize the independence and sovereignty of Syria. And so when Joe Biden has his summit for democracies, the issues of contradiction, the issue of hypocrisy raises itself, Brian.
Absolutely. That is such a key point. And I think when you see them talking about these things, and when the Secretary of State talks about these issues, notice how they never interact with the public, and notice how they only interact with a carefully selected cadre from the Western media, because it wouldn't stand up, not for a moment, under even the slightest scrutiny, because it is so rank with hypocrisy. Think about this: they're complaining about Russia in Ukraine, while at the exact same time, the U.S. is undermining China's sovereignty regarding Taiwan. And this is something that you could go to the State Department's website and they say they recognize Taiwan as part of China. It's not a country. It's not independent. That's what it says on the State Department's website. Yet they're funneling weapons and political support and doing unauthorized visits and flights to Taiwan. So they are at the exact same time they are needling Russia. They're undermining China's sovereignty. So it's impossible to take them serious. I don't think at this point anyone seriously believes that the U.S. is standing up for any of these principles. These principles are a smokescreen that they hide behind.
I also think there's some dynamics changing in the in the Middle East that are of consequence here for a couple of reasons. The U.S. had allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and in particular in Syria, they were working with Turkey and Saudi Arabia to undermine Syria, the Syrian government. Now, everyone involved can look at the Middle East and say, we've got two powers coming in. One of them is bringing peace and stability. The other one is bringing war and instability. And I've thought about this for a while. The U.S. in Syria, which is an unstable area that they've created, have some protections from some of these jihadist groups, because some of the jihadist groups are funded by Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and everybody knows that, right? When Saudi Arabia and Turkey start to back off and take off their level of protection and support, these groups don't like the U.S. any more than anybody else. So I think that there are groups now smelling blood in the water. You know, the bully is getting weak. Nobody's protecting them anymore. I think the time when the U.S. could stay in Syria unmolested is over. That if they're going to stay in Syria, there are a lot of groups that don't like them, that every chance they get, they're going to throw a drone or a missile at them, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. They can stay there, but they're not going to stay there unmolested. Your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The whole idea, the deterrent that America had, because they were locked in with these these other proxies that they were working with, and now they're again incrementally turning their back on the U.S. So the U.S. is isolated, and what could the U.S. do? In reality, they would have to commit to a major military operation, a buildup in eastern Syria. But from where? If Saudi Arabia is turning their back on the U.S., if Turkey is incrementally distancing itself, where are they going to even stage the military buildup to do that? Are they going to do that in eastern Syria? And then where is that going to leave their proxy war with Russia and Ukraine, and this war they're very clearly preparing for with China? Now, you were talking about Syria as part of a proxy war against Iran, which is in turn a proxy war against Russia and China. And I don't know if people remember General Wesley Clark giving that speech about 7 nations in 7 years, and that was them, the U.S., trying to wipe out all of these potential allies of both Russia and China before Russia reemerged and China rose. And then there was a 2009 Brookings Institution paper called Which Path to Persia? And they said, in order to go to war and succeed against Iran, we have to deal with Syria first. That was 2009, and then 2011 came along. So they write these things out in great detail, and then they execute it. That is actually how foreign policy in the U.S. works. So it's really important for people to understand that and to look at those policy papers, which is basically a signed and dated confession of what they plan to do over the next 5, 10, even 20 years.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that has happened, though, is they've had a monkey wrench thrown in the gears, a spanner in the works, as they would say in Europe, in that these plans were about world hegemony. We're going to take this country, then take that country. We're going to continue to expand like the octopus and grab everything, right? And they woke up one day and they're like, uh-oh, China. And rather than simply us being able to reach out and grab everything unmolested, only worrying about these little countries and nobody can oppose us, China, Russia, India, these other countries are starting to rise and actually provide an alternative. So now we have to go from trying to eat these little countries one at a time to we have to knock down the potential powers that would rival us. And it's simply turned into an out of control panic. That's the way I'll put it. Like, let me throw that at you. The U.S. policy, to me, if I had to give it a name, I would say panic is foreign policy. What do you think?
I absolutely agree. It is panic. And when you read the policy papers from, say, around 2000 to, say, about 2010, they thought they were going to achieve all of this, and they are now so far behind schedule. And the reason is because so many things have changed. Not only is Russia reemerging and China is rising, but they have been helping build up all of these other countries militarily, economically, politically. Russia and China are very good at defending their own information space. A lot of other nations are learning from that and protecting their own information space from things like color revolution. So it's making it more and more difficult for the U.S. to take advantage and exploit these countries the way they used to. And this disparity in technology that the West has maintained for generations, really, that is gone. That's out the window. The playing field has leveled in terms of technology and industry, and now the balance of power geopolitically is going to accordingly follow. So this is the situation the U.S. is in at this point. To insist that the U.S. is going to prevent China, a nation with a population many times larger than the U.S., industrial base several times larger, millions more engineers graduated every year than the U.S., that to start from that premise, which is rooted in absolute fantasy, everything built on top of that is going to go further and further diverted away from reality. And what kind of policy can come out of that other than something that's desperate and panicked?
You know, you mentioned the word color revolution, and immediately I thought of Paris. Immediately I thought of France. You know, these contrived protests that happen from country to country. You look at it and it's like, yes, Victoria Nuland and Samantha Power just flew over a country, and all of a sudden there are people running around in the street saying, you know what? Usually they have like American flag, the giveaway. There's a revolution, so-called, and protest in a country, and they just happen to have American flags and EU flags and nicely printed, very nicely printed banners that they're holding up that says we want democracy or something like that. And you're like, that looks awful suspicious, right? But the thing about it is now they don't work anymore. They don't work anymore. Iran, remember they recently tried them. It's like as soon as you see it start, you're like, don't they understand it? People are hip to them. Like Iran was like, okay, we know what happens. They come in, they protest for a couple weeks, they do a couple terrorist acts, they get bored, they realize it ain't going to work, and they move on. The color revolution game, first of all, they don't even know how to do it anymore. They just like do some violence. It's like their foreign policy. We're going to get some unrest. We'll get some violence, and we don't know how, but somehow the government's going to change. And now that doesn't work anymore. But there is an organic uncolored revolution apparently going on in Paris. I'm looking at that. I'm thinking, that's what you guys are trying to do, isn't it? What are your thoughts on the Paris protests, shall we say? Colorless revolution.
Well, it's interesting, and I've seen a lot of people point out the irony here that all of these nations, along with the United States in Europe, decided to put sanctions on Russia, hoping to trigger protests like this inside Russia. And the U.S. had networks that they were cultivating for years and years to try to do this in Russia. Russia dismantled them. And in Belarus and in Georgia, we saw that very recently. But now you've got these protests erupting in France. People are rightfully angry. They're going to come out. They're going to come out in other countries across the West. The problem that I see, unfortunately, is they use the same tricks to divide, distract, and get groups fighting against each other across the West. So it's going to be very difficult for them to organize. There are probably legitimate protests. You never know, though. Maybe Emmanuel Macron was getting cold feet or something. He didn't want to go any further in regards to Ukraine. So they're like, well, we'll burn Paris down. You never know. But I think that there's a likelihood that they're genuine. The anger is real. If you look at what's going on in Europe, these governments clearly do not have the European people's best interest at heart. They're making decisions that originate in Washington for Washington's benefit at Europe's cost. And France is an example. Germany is the prime example. I mean, the most striking example. There have been protests in Germany as well. It's just how far do they go, and what realistic chance do they have to change anything? Because the way they have democracy set up in the West, they've got Party A and Party B, and they're all answering to the same circle of special interests, unfortunately.
The thing I think about France is this. What we're seeing is you can push people, but so far. And even all of the machinations of the international deep state to the US or the UK or whatever, anybody who even appears, if it's a Bernie Sanders at some point or Jeremy Corbyn at some point, who even appeared that they may be pushing against the mainstream, they took them out just in case. And they replaced them with a Keir Starmer or whoever the heck, or Joe Biden. So you look at this and you say, okay, they believe that they've set this thing up so they can't lose. Heads we win, tails you lose, right? Politically speaking. But that only works until the people stop cooperating with the government. And in France, it appears that it's getting to the point where the people aren't playing the game anymore. As long as people are willing to say, okay, fine, we'll do this, but we're not happy. But you can get to, always you can get to a point where the people simply say, this is not a country anymore. This is going to be an anarchic madhouse. If you guys want to try to rule that, you can try to rule that. You can try to beat us down, but you're not going to have a country, and the whole world's going to be looking at you saying, what do you do with this? And I just think this kind of thing was inevitable, and it's inevitable in other countries. Once the people wake up and realize that democracy, independence, and sovereignty is an illusion, then they got one or two choices. And in France, obviously, I think they've made a choice. And I don't see how you walk this back. I don't see how you get the people in France off the street without giving them what they want. And at some point, it goes from, okay, we want this pension reform moved back 2 years, to, okay, that ain't good enough. You know what I mean? And I think they've pushed the French to a point. Interesting with the history of revolution in France. You know, isn't it funny how when you view things through the context of history, they align so well? But I don't know. I do have a feeling that they may have pushed France to a point where the people aren't going to accept the heads I win. You know, just put another version of Macron in, and we'll accept that until he screws us so bad we can't take it again.
The thing that I think is important for everyone to watch is what happens with the U.S. and European economy. The way they're painting themselves into this corner with the sanctions against Russia. Now they're preparing some sort of conflict with China. They're attempting to isolate all of these nations that are not cooperating and going along with their agenda anymore. But in reality, they're isolating themselves. Now we see these financial crises beginning to sprout, and this is because the West's entire economy there's very little actual substance. We see the West struggling to supply Ukraine with enough weapons to continue this proxy war because their industrial base has deteriorated so much so over the last couple of decades, and whether the people in France continue protesting or not, none of this is sustainable. It's going to grind to a halt eventually. And the fact that the French people are protesting, this is just another complication that may actually help accelerate this whole process. And they don't have a plan. The people in charge, whether they try to ditch Macron, get someone else, buy some time, kick the can down the road, it doesn't matter, because fundamentally they are not prepared to change anything about what they're doing. They have this obsession with this unipolar world order that they've created that has served them for, again, generations, really. And they're not going to give it up. They're not going to give it up to a rising China and a reemergent Russia and the rest of the world. Like, what would make sense? What would be sensible? They're not going to do that. So unfortunately, I think these circles of interest have to collapse. They have to destroy themselves, essentially. And then hopefully someone with a more constructive mindset fills the void. And I think there probably are a lot of special interests in Europe that are subordinated to US interests that would like to kind of at least get things turned around so that at least their foreign policy reflects European interests. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with you. The term I've been using with a lot of things is collapse. I think that's what we're seeing. The reality that countries that don't produce anything, that money is made through complex financial tools, that is just ultimately they're magic, and it's a self-serving racket for the rich, has put them in a position where there's a big hollow thing that basically the economy is hollow. It doesn't produce anything. It can't make anything. Even the things that it makes are very poorly made. And this financialized tools thing that the city of New York and the city of Wall Street and the city of London has created now is getting to the point where they have to, it's spun out of control. And I think over the course of this summer, we're looking at a different style, but a 2008 style crash where you get the implosion. And now you can't support this military monstrous worldwide machine anymore because you just don't have the money. And now you're dealing with people internal. The internal collapse is what'll I think will bring about the fall of the empire. But speaking of the word collapse, let's go to Ukraine. That's a term I've been using a long time. Very beginning, when people were like, how do you think this ends? I said, collapse. At some point, political. I think the Russians, whether intentionally or not, let me ask you about this, Brian. I'll throw this at you. People thought, okay, the Russians just want to overwhelm and crush the army. I said, well, I don't know if they want to or not. I don't know if this is intentional or organic, but what I think happens is bit by bit by bit, the Russians put more and more and more pressure on them, to the point where, because people were afraid, well, will NATO come in? Well, now we know NATO doesn't have anything to come in and fight with. But the bottom line, even if they wanted to step in some way, shape, or form, if there is a political and military collapse in Ukraine, there's nothing to come in and support. You can't come in and support troops when they're all running for their lives and the military is collapsing. You can't come in and support a government when they're like shooting each other, falling apart. What do you think about my theory that the Ukraine neocon project ends in collapse and that there's not going to be anything there for them to save or support?
I think that is what Russia is going for. And, you know, they've, from the very beginning, they always left a multitude of options open for Ukraine and their Western sponsors to end it anytime they want through negotiations. The West knows full well why Russia is in Ukraine and why they're doing this. They pretend like they don't, but they know full well why. And they know how they could end this at any time, but they're not going to. And I think Russia was fully prepared for that possibility. And so that is what they're doing. They've been increasing the pressure on Ukraine militarily, economically, on the infrastructure, and they're going to continue increasing that. And we see them doing it militarily all along the line of contact, more and more pressure until cracks start to form, and then collapses start to happen. And then eventually what you end up with is the total collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity. Their economy is already totally destroyed. It's the Walking Dead. The U.S. and the EU are pumping money into it to keep it animated, but it is gone. And politically, well, we know that in Kiev, they're not really making any decisions on their own. This is all for appearance. It's Washington, it's London, it's Brussels that are making the decisions for Ukraine, what happens economically, militarily, and politically. So you're right. That is what Russia is doing. People said, well, no, they wanted to go in and overwhelm Ukraine in 3 days. Obviously, Russia prepared years ahead of time, huge amounts of ammunition, weapons, reorganizing their whole military to fight in a protracted and intense, large-scale conflict. And that is what they're doing now. They're prepared, and NATO wasn't.
What do you think? What are your thoughts on something I've been discussing, and that is what appears to be on the contact line, the formation of multiple cauldrons, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and these cauldrons are not complete encirclements, but they're not far from a complete. I put it like this: I wouldn't want to be in the midst of them with Russian soldiers all the way around me if I weren't on the side of the Russian soldiers. It's not pretty. The formation of multiple cauldrons, is that a sign that things are about to collapse, or is that can things go on for a while? What does it? Or let me ask you this: your thoughts on the cauldron, and does it mean anything that we're seeing the formation of multiple cauldrons?
I think it does. I saw your other live stream. Andre was talking about the unit cohesion, the military cohesion breaking down. And that was inevitable. If you don't have enough weapons, you don't have enough ammunition, your trained manpower is being destroyed faster than you can replace it, and your enemy has more of absolutely everything. This is inevitable. Avdiivka was fortified over 8 or 9 years. It was a heavily fortified city. It was something that Russia would have wanted to take care of immediately if possible, but they couldn't because it was so heavily defended. And the defense line that it's a part of was so well defended. But they've been chipping away at it now for over a year, and now we're starting to see those cracks form. That's what's allowing these encirclements to take place. The fact that Ukraine is not able to stop this process shows the gradual deterioration of their forces on all levels. And people are wondering, why doesn't Russia just launch an offensive and take huge tracts of territory? That's not how they're fighting this. It's a war of attrition. It's a gradual process. The failure of Ukraine's forces will be a gradual process. I don't think there will be like one day we wake up and we see everything. When we look back on it, we'll see a definite point where everything started to fall apart. But as we're watching this unfold, it'll be very gradual. But the encirclement of Avdiivka, people who have been following this conflict closely, the fact that is happening, along with the encirclement of Bakhmut, it tells you a lot about how overstretched and how strained Ukraine's military is. They're talking about this grand offensive that they want to launch, but they've got these encirclements taking place. Are they just going to ignore that? Do they have enough manpower to address both? And it appears that they really don't.
Well, the other part of it is this that I see: when you put pressure all along the contact line, like, whatever, 1,000 kilometers or whatever, when one area gets weak, you have to redistribute forces to support this area. And it gets to the point where you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. where it gets to a point where bit by bit, you don't have the forces to redistribute. And then you have to start making decisions. Are we going to let this one fall or that one fall? Well, when one of them falls, now there's a breakthrough in one area and you're starting to get huge cauldrons formed. And I think that's why I say at some point, I think Russia, they bleed and bleed and bleed. And at some point they look at it and I don't see a time, because the Ukrainian leadership is not in charge of their forces, when the Ukrainian leadership will have the authority to say, okay, we got to negotiate a settlement. We lost. I see the Ukrainian leadership saying to the NATO leaders, hey man, US, forget NATO, there's no such thing. Hey guys, we need to negotiate a settlement, and them just saying, just hold out. Wait a minute, you still have living soldiers. Why would you settle when you still have living soldiers? Don't come to us for a settlement until the last Ukrainian is dead. Once the last Ukrainian is dead, then we'll see if we can find some Poles or Romanians or maybe Latvians or whatever. Not a lot of them, but we'll throw them in there. That's what they're looking at. And I think at that point, not only does Ukraine fall, this is what I see. When Ukraine crumbles, the whole NATO alliance, I think, crumbles with it. Anyway, your thoughts?
It's a good point. NATO really has no legitimacy at all, hasn't for the longest time, if it ever did. Their whole thing since the 21st century was waging wars of aggression, not in places not even remotely close to NATO territory, that had no means of threatening NATO territory. So that's what they've been doing, waging proxy wars, intervening in Libya, in their NATO members, not in NATO's name, but they're in Syria, they were in Iraq, they were in Afghanistan. So this was always all about encircling and containing Russia. We've heard NATO toying with the idea of expanding this to China as well. And if they fail, or when they fail in Ukraine, what is their next move? Because the reason they're failing in Ukraine is they don't have enough military industrial capacity to wage this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. Then what capacity of any kind are they going to have to do anything like this anywhere else? The veneer of invincibility that the West has tried to maintain over the last several decades, since the end of World War II, really, that is falling away. And what is left is just this spent empire that's trying to achieve something whose time came and went long ago.
See, add this, and I think this is critical at the end of this conflict. Let's say it ends like you and I are saying. The Ukraine line crumbles, and the political situation there starts falling apart, and the Russians have now come through, and things are kind of really going south, and they're kind of overwhelmed what's left of the Ukrainian army. Not saying that'll happen today or tomorrow, but let's just say that happens. At that point, the point of NATO is ostensibly to defend the North Atlantic countries, the Western Europe, from the Russian hordes. And what are we told? Why, if he takes Ukraine, Putin will continue on to Berlin and all the way to the English Channel. Okay, they take Ukraine, and Putin says, all right, you guys ready to negotiate or whatever, or not? It's up to you. Well, aren't you going to continue on to Berlin or the English Channel? Why would I want to? And at that point, the Western European countries will be like, we couldn't stop you if you wanted to, because we've used up all of our weapons. We've thrown everything we had into Ukraine. You chewed it up and spit it out. We got nothing to defend ourselves. And if you wanted to, you could keep going, but you don't want to. No, I don't want to. I just want peace. At that point, the world and the people look at it and say, what are we doing here with this NATO thing? These people could hit us now. They have no desire to. We've been told that if the Russian hordes ever got the opportunity, if NATO wasn't there to protect us, that they would just mow us down like cordwood and cook us and eat us for breakfast. And everything evaporates at that point, Brian.
It's a good point, but even before we reach that point, just think about how NATO is emptying their arsenals, handing everything that they have over to Ukraine. The UK has sent all of their self-propelled artillery guns to Ukraine. They have nothing left. France has sent all of their Caesar, or most of their Caesar self-propelled guns. So if they actually really feared Russia, if they honestly thought Russia was a threat to Europe, why would they be doing this? They wouldn't be doing this. And this is the biggest piece of evidence of all of how disingenuous NATO's fears are. They are shedding all of their defenses, pumping it into Ukraine. They know this is their last chance at Russia, and they know that Russia isn't interested in waging war with the rest of Europe. You know what they're doing, and the reason why they haven't overreacted to all of Europe's provocations, because they want to go back to doing business with Europe. They imagine in their mind a day where Nord Stream is fixed or expanded, and they could go back to doing business with Europe, because that's what they wanted. That's what actually I think is in Europe's best interest. They weren't allowed to do that because they've got this shadow of American hegemony cast over them. They cannot, no matter how hard they try, get out from under that. And I think NATO being exposed this way would be a very positive step toward the actual real security and prosperity of Europe. NATO is the biggest threat to Europe's prosperity and security.
Your thoughts on Germany? A couple of things. The Nord Stream pipeline blast, and when that happened, you know, there was a couple of people. We got several things to talk about Germany. Let's start with that. There were a lot of people that were like, the U.S. will just get away with it, and I just thought to myself, man, I've said this, in the long run, years from now, we all hopefully make it. People will be writing books saying that's the thing that changed the world. I really believe that, because there's no way ultimately to wiggle out of it. It's always there in the background. It's always there. There's always people, somebody somewhere saying, I want to know something about that. And as things get worse and worse and worse for Germany, the cries for justice, the cries for more knowledge are going to get louder and louder. I don't see, in the short run, it may appear that the Biden team has gotten away with it somewhat. I don't think it really does. But in the long run, I think that's going to be a major, major issue, like next winter when they're really in trouble. Anyway, your thoughts, Brian, on Nord Stream?
I agree with you. When you really think about it, the U.S.'s response to Nord Stream 2's construction over all of those years, it was just like you said before. It's desperation. It's panic. They were panicking. They were desperate. They were so desperate they were threatening their own allies with sanctions to try to stop it. They were talking about this is a threat to European energy security and sovereignty, and yet the U.S. was dictating to Europe what they can and cannot do in regards to their energy supply. So when you think about it, they were so openly ridiculous and desperate to stop it, even at that point. And then eventually they got so desperate that they literally blew up the pipelines. That is not a country that is in a position of strength and with significant influence. That is someone drowning and trying to pull everyone else down with them. That's what that was. And I do think that it will be a symbol of this turning point where the U.S. was no longer able to influence from a position of strength, and instead began resorting to more and more extreme measures to try to change things in their favor after their influence has already slipped away from them. I mean, just think about Germany, how this impacts them. They will never get energy that cheap again until the pipeline is repaired. If it's repaired, from now until that happens, they are going to always have higher energy prices because it's always going to be more expensive to liquefy gas, send it across the Atlantic and receive it and distribute it. It will always be more expensive to do that than to get it from an existing pipeline from Russia. And that is going to, and many people have pointed this out, it's going to destroy Europe's ability to compete industrially. And guess what? It's not as if Russia doesn't have other customers for this energy. They're sending it all to Asia now. And Asia already has a huge advantage in terms of industrial output. This is going to enhance it further. So it's one of those, we in our personal lives, we all know people who have problems and they make decisions that just accelerate and expand all of these problems, makes everything worse. That is what the U.S. is doing on a geopolitical level.
I also think that what that does is it implicitly exposes the truth about NATO. If you look at what happened here, right? What is NATO supposed to be? It's supposed to be an alliance that comes together to protect the group, to protect these community in the alliance, the coalition from an outside entity, of course, being the evil Russians. They literally got members of the alliance to come together against another member in the alliance, and they used a exercise. They were having a military exercise called Bolt Ops 22, which was exercising, practicing, defending themselves from Russia. They literally used that as cover to attack Germany. I believe that the time will come in Germany, sooner or later, they're going to have elections. And sooner or later, somebody's going to be running that's going to say, hey, guys, here's what I'm running on. That there will be some dissident. There will be somebody who literally runs on that. There will be people. Sooner or later, there's going to be elections in Europe. And when there will be parties running on reality saying, look what happened in Germany. Look what they did. Look at this cockamamie story they came up. The narrative they have will eventually be attacked. And I believe it'll be attacked in various countries when they have elections. This guy, is it Slovakia? This guy, Rico, that's running right now, who's in the lead, who is opposed to the sanctions. I believe it was Slovakia's government that fell, and they're having a slap election. I think that's what you're going to see. People running who are Orban types, not saying necessarily ideologically aligned with them, maybe not. I'm a lefty. I'm just saying it doesn't matter. You're going to see people running who are saying, here's real actual things that happened. I'm going to run outside of this NATO narrative. And buddy, there is nothing sweeter to run on for the person, for somebody like that. There's no better example for them to run on, no better platform than to say, let's take, for instance, the attack on the sailboaters, pro-Ukrainian guys on a friggin' sailboat who attacked, anyway, your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. And it's important for people to put ideology aside. You're talking about elections in Europe, and as long as that incoming government has a bigger concern for the interests of the people there, then I guess it really doesn't matter. That's for them to sort out their internal political affairs. But what we do want to see are governments that come into power and start taking care of the people's interests, their national interests, not this agenda imposed on them from Washington. When you hear the incumbent government in Germany right now, when they talk about what they're doing, they don't even make any sense. At certain times, they'll even say, and not just Germany, this is a trend across a lot of Europe right now. You hear people come out and say, I don't care what the people want. We're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Because, we're fighting for democracy. And while we're doing that, we're just going to completely suspend the concept of working for the people's interests while we do this. Because we don't care that the people in Italy or Germany, they're not buying it, and they're not interested in making these sacrifices for this agenda. And then when you peel away the layers and you see what is actually going on, why this proxy war is taking place in Ukraine in the first place, more and more people are going to wake up to that reality, and they're not going to go back to sleep. So this is a ticking time bomb for them, among many others. This is a huge ticking time bomb for them. The population waking up and being incapable of going back to sleep, even if they want to.
What are your thoughts on the Putin-Xi meeting?
Well, it's indicative of something that has been going on for a really long time. A lot of people seem to think that Russia and China have many differences, but as a matter of fact, across the majority of their collective history, they have spent more time cooperating and acting as good neighbors than they have at odds with each other. As a matter of fact, points in history where they've been at odds with each other were anomalies. Now they have all of these common interests to begin with, and now they have this common threat that they're facing, and they've obviously going to face it together. And this meeting was basically Russia and China asserting reality in the middle of this fantasy world that the West has created. You still have people holding out hope that somehow China is going to side with the U.S. against Russia regarding Ukraine, but China knows that they're next. They're already subjected to the same type of geopolitical and national security threat the U.S. created for Russia and Ukraine. They have the exact same problem regarding Taiwan, which it's actually worse because that is part of their internationally recognized territory. And this is where the U.S. is planning their next Ukraine-style proxy war. So that's just, I think it's just the beginning. You see the West freaking out over it. They're going to have much more to be concerned about because this is only going to accelerate.
I agree. I agree. The other thing I think is, and I'll get your comments on this, the U.S., the U.S. empire, is always about, they're always looking at things like, we're going to do a full spectrum attack on whatever country it is or whoever they don't like, right? We're going to go after them in the informational sphere, which the informational sphere always means actually lying to their own people. So their own people support something that's not in their best interest. These info wars that the West launches are never against the other guy. It's always an info war to like censor people in their own country and put out all kind of propaganda on US, on US TV. But this full spectrum war, we're going after in all spheres. Well, when I look at what's going on with Russia and China, and one of the reasons I keep saying time is on their side, because there's of course the military component of this conflict. That's Russia is doing that. Russia and China are doing there's a diplomatic component. You see that in all throughout Africa, particularly we've seen it recently in the Middle East. And we see Russia and China working together. China goes to the Middle East. They get this deal. We look at Russia. He's got all of the African Union for a week. There's this big forum with the African leaders. He's working on getting some peace deals. They're clearly diplomatically working together at the highest levels to get a grip on the Middle East. They understand the importance of that, of securing stability in that region. There's an economic sphere where, hey, they've grabbed Mexico. Mexico wants to be in the BRICS, So what are your thoughts on the fact that you can see this proxy war that the U.S. is working on in Ukraine? But when you look at the diplomatic area, when you look at the economic sphere, when you look at those things, clearly the U.S. is on its back. I mean, Blinken and Kamala Harris, of all people, they're running around Africa trying to, work things out. Clearly, China and China and Russia are far better, and they are just really winning in the economic and diplomatic sphere of this conflict. It is a full spectrum conflict, but the U.S. hasn't really acknowledged. They won't come out and say we're fighting a battle with Russia and China in the economic and diplomatic sphere. But your thoughts on that worldwide, this other conflict going on, and the coalitions, might I add, the building of coalitions economically, diplomatically, Brian?
Well, from my point of view, I think that it's a kind of a downhill battle for Russia and China. I mean, they go to Africa or Southeast Asia or Central Asia, the Middle East. A lot of these countries that are supposedly allies with the U.S., I use the word hostage because in many ways they were hostages. There was no alternative, and they made a deal with the U.S., give them what they want, and carve out a little, safe space for themselves while their country is exploited, sent from one proxy war to the next, all around the world, expending resources in service of U.S. hegemony. Now they have an alternative. It's a very attractive alternative. And these are countries that are not demanding any sort of change in the way they run their internal political affairs. What they're basically doing is they're just following international law and the primacy of national sovereignty. And that is very attractive to virtually, I can't imagine any country where that is not a more attractive alternative. The U.S. has had and has this advantage in terms of military and soft power and their ability. They have the National Endowment for Democracy operates in virtually every country on earth. And they've got these networks that they've built up over decades, constantly part of the equation. And that is what they do. They're threatening and coercing these nations. But at some point, their weakness is going to allow these nations to slip out from under their grip. And it's going to be a domino effect. And as more and more nations get out, it's going to be easier for more and more other nations to follow. So that they're, again, like you said, it's panic. They're panicking. They're running around Africa. They're running around Southeast Asia. They have empty hands. They have nothing to offer. the carrot and the stick. They've got rotten carrots and their stick is broken. And this is the problem that they have. And there's no way for them to reverse it. They're looking at their industrial base. They realize it's inadequate. It takes years and years to fix that, even if they genuinely wanted to. And they're just incapable of doing it. It's not going to happen.
Well, and I would say what used to be their strength, this soft power, national endowments for democracy, all that stuff, has become their weakness, because their only play is one of coercion, of threats, of violence, of undermining legitimate governments. Now Russia and China are coming in, and they have the context of history. You hear the Africans say, well, when these colonial powers were treating us like crap for years and years, Russia was helping us fight against the imperial powers. China was leaving us alone. They were poor like we were. They didn't have much. They minded their own business. So now the U.S. comes back, and Tony Blinken's in one country saying, we're your friends. And Linda Thomas Greenfield is saying to another country, you better do what we want or we'll punish you. So they don't even know how to use anything. They don't have an option for a carrot. You know what I mean? All they ever use is the stick. And now I think they're in a position where they don't have the tools that they need, the legitimate tools, because if they come to somebody smiling, it's like the people see it like the mafia. Hey, man, we're here to help you. And that means you better do what we say or we're going to kill you. That's all it ever means. Now, let me ask you this. You're in Asia. Your thoughts on the AUKUS submarine deal? And that doesn't seem to be playing out as well in Australia as they thought it would. I didn't see that coming, but I'm hearing there's some real pushback in Australia. Do you know anything about that and your thoughts on AUKUS?
Well, AUKUS is an anti-China alliance, and that's not really an alliance. It's the U.S. using and the U.K. using Australia as yet another disposable proxy. And it will destroy, if Australia goes ahead with this, it will destroy Australia. And unfortunately, despite the pushback, because we saw pushback in Germany all of those years Nord Stream 2 was being built, we saw a lot of pushback. We saw the German government create loopholes to circumvent U.S. sanctions. But at the end of the day, the U.S. succeeded. It's always easier to destroy than to build something. And it's going to be easier for them to get in there, corrupt, and destroy Australia than it will be for the Australian people to preserve their sovereignty. I mean, they have no sovereignty. The U.S. is dictating their foreign policy to them. And we have to understand what is AUKUS supposed to be defending against? They're saying, China's this big threat. Australia has to defend themselves against this big threat. China is their largest trading partner. Their largest trading partner. China is definitely getting way more from Australia by doing business with them than they ever would through some and way down the road military operation, because China doesn't even have the military necessary to project military power like that. That's something that even U.S. policy think tanks repeatedly state in their policy papers. China doesn't have a blue water navy. They don't have the ability to project power. Their military is there to defend Chinese territory, and they're quite happy about that fact. But then they lie to the people in Australia. They make it out as if there's Chinese people hiding under everyone's bed. And it works. It works because there's still way too many people in Australia that are, I would say, ignorant, possibly even racist, who go along with all of this, just like we see in the U.S. It's for them, that part is a downhill battle because you already had these elements in Western society for so long. So they're taking advantage of that fear, ignorance, racism. They're taking advantage of that to push all of this through. They're working with corrupt politicians who don't care about Australia's long-term interests. And when you think about it, when you get these nuclear-powered submarines, what's the point of having a nuclear-powered submarine? Long range and endurance. It's not to protect Australia around Australia. It's meant to join the U.S. right off the coast of China to menace China. And they're talking about China being provocative, but the very existence of AUKUS and what it is doing is a provocation, a needless provocation. And people should look at the trade between China and Australia. It's amazing that they're going to disrupt and destroy this. And Australia also, the rest of their trade is all in Asia. So they're going to disrupt stability in Asia. They're going to completely destroy their economy. And an example to look at how this all works is look at Ukraine. when they overthrew the elected government in 2014, they put a rabidly anti-Russian regime in power. They irrationally cut all ties, economic, industrial ties with the rest of Russia, and their economy cratered. And this conflict has completely sealed the deal, but it was never going to recover from that until they reversed course. And that is exactly the path Australia is heading on. Nobody's going to benefit from this except a very small handful of people at the top.
I do think this, just to get back, to tie this to the Ukraine conflict. At the end of the conflict, the U.S. is, okay, we're going to have a coalition to go after China. They're going to have a real problem. I don't see, it's like the plan is we take out Russia first, and then we dismember Russia. We eat Russia alive, and we bring in all of its resources, and we show all of our allies how powerful we are, and we arm them further. And now we're all going to be stronger and more powerful. And Russia's not there to help China. Then we go after China, and we're going to be even stronger. But you go after Russia, and Russia wins, and your allies are pathetic, and they're falling apart, and they're unstable, and their number one trading partner is China, and they are not in the mood. Macron, Germany, even no matter how much they go along, they know that if they go along with anything against China, they turn into Port-au-Prince. They would, Haiti would be a wealthy community beside a wealthy country beside, which of course is abused by the U.S. That's a whole other story, but would be a wealthy country beside what they look like when this happens. So you're going to, to me, to go after China, they had to have some success in the Ukraine project. For that to fall apart so horribly, for that to go so catastrophically wrong, what will be left, if much of anything, economically, because we see what's happening with the banks, of this ragtag coalition, they won't be in a situation, they won't be able to go after Greenland if they wanted to. It will be broken economically. It will be broken, militarily disarmed. It will be looking like Paris right now with trash and fires on the streets all over the place. The banks will be broke. The dollar will be will be worth 100 to 1 what it is now. I don't see what's left of the U.S. empire when and if they use this, not if, when this Ukraine conflict starts to fall, completely apart, that they'll be in a situation to go after China or anybody else. I think they'll be trying to patch this thing together with bubble gum and duct tape. They'll be trying to hold this thing together because the voices in Europe will be saying, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of this.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with you on that. And the scariest part about everything that you're saying, it's all true. The scariest thing is, I think they realize that. I think they realize that that's what's at stake, which makes this proxy war in Ukraine so dangerous. Because if that's your future, if you fail in Ukraine, and that is your future, your empire evaporating essentially, and you may be possibly held accountable, what wouldn't they do to try to win? And so this is what makes it so scary. We don't know what they're going to try to do to try to pull something off, to try to reverse course here. And then we see them rushing into a conflict with China. And the reason they're doing that, and this shows you how departed they are from reality. They understand that China is continuously growing, expanding economically, militarily. They know that around 2025, between 2025 and 2030, the window closes forever for the U.S. to do anything militarily to coerce China. That they will never be able to after that point. It'll never happen. So they're rushing to do that at the same time running this proxy war. And if you go all the way back to Wesley Clark and the Seven Nations in 7 years, and you kind of get an idea of what their timeline was then, and you see how far behind they are on that timeline, and you realize that they're still trying to do it anyway. It's insanity. And when someone is not thinking rationally, we can't predict what they will do next. So I think for all of the reasons you just mentioned, that's what makes this proxy war so dangerous. I think that's why Russia's been so patient and incremental with their escalation, because they understand how dangerous this is. And I think China understands how dangerous this is. They want this. The irony is the West is going to destroy themselves, and they only have themselves to blame. And it'll be nations like Russia and China that actually create the conditions where they can get back up on their feet and become a constructive member among nations rather than imposing themselves on all other nations, unlike what the US and Europe did to the Soviet Union when it collapsed. That's the ultimate irony, that these are supposed to be huge threats to global order, peace, and stability, and yet they're going to be the ones that ultimately help the West get back on its feet after they're done destroying themselves.
Well, the other thing is, now this has been my position for a long time, and I read a speech. I like to read all of Vladimir Putin's speeches, and there was something that I picked up in a couple different speeches where he talked about the irrationality of the neocons, and he said he'd mention cooling the hotheads, and he would mention, his speech would kind of go into a crescendo like, yeah, these people are nuts, they're dangerous, blah 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 blah, and then, but we can cool the hotheads in DC. I believe we'll have to cool the hotheads. We'll do what we need to do to cool the hotheads. And I believe this: the governments of China and Russia are quite rational, and they look. You know, when you're dealing with a crazy person, you know when you're dealing with a person who's completely insane, that it's different than dealing with a rational person, and you know you have to deal with them far differently. You know the level of danger is a lot higher, particularly if that guy's got like an M16 in his hand. Okay, I believe that the leadership of Russia and China sees it as their duty, and both of them have said things leading to this, even in the latest meeting. They see it as their duty to guide the world into a multipolar system in a way that does it without the crazy neocons killing everybody. I think they see that as their duty. Remember, the other thing is, Putin said the next 10 years is going to be a dangerous decade. And then what did he do next? We're building our military up to 2 million people. Defensive, right? And I think that was this. We've got to have a military that says to them, don't even try it. So we've got to have a military capability that says to them, don't even think about it defensively. And then Russia and China, I think, will see themselves, the leadership, as a person, as the people that are like, because we have the economic and military power, because we are we're the other big nuke guys in the and they know that to come after us is suicide. We have a responsibility and the ability to guide the world into a multipolar paradigm. So I think they know what they're up against, but I think they believe that's what they believe, which as dangerous as the neocons are, that's the hope for humanity. Your thoughts?
I agree. And if you look at the proxy war in Syria, and you look at the Russian intervention from 2015 onward, at the invitation of the Syrian government, they suffered one humiliation after the other, one setback after the other. Turkey shooting down their warplane, militants ambushing the rescue team. And I remember at the time, people following that, they were enraged. They were wondering, what is Russia going to do in retaliation? And they really didn't do much of anything. They were patient, and they let the time go by. They let everything cool down because they were not going to escalate. They knew that that's what that was done to achieve, and they refused to do it. A lot of people wanted revenge, but I tried to remind people that the greatest type of revenge is succeeding rather than getting some sort of short-term emotional satisfaction at the cost of your end game. They stuck to their end goal, and they laser focused on that. And I think they're going to do the same thing in Ukraine. So a lot of people are saying, oh, they left Kherson, the Kharkov, this, that. It's all so humiliating. What are they doing? Why are they playing around? It's just like you're saying. They understand they're dealing with someone who's crazy, and they're going to do this as cautiously and as incrementally as they feel is necessary to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, look at the last few weeks. As the neocons get dangerous, get more and more desperate, and they see a loss in front of them, they do the provocation with the drone and the threats. Then the depleted uranium rounds, and what you get and understandably so, there is a feeling of anger. They're embarrassing us. They're humiliating us, right? The need to punch back. And so you see, and I see it, people in Russia and people who support Russia saying, doggone it, Putin's not going to do anything. The Russians never do anything. Provocation after provocation. But if the idea of provocation is to get you to punch, then the way I win is not giving you what you want. If you know, if I do this, you'll do that, then you're in control. If you do this and I don't do it. In Zen, we have a saying, throwing a rock down a well and not hearing a splash. If your enemy continually throws the rock down the well and listens for that splash, and he never hears the splash, he's left in confusion because he never knows what's at the other end of that well. And I think that's where, remember the Pelosi thing. Everybody said, well, that's it. Chinese are going to war. And they were like, they want us to go to war. That's why they did it. They're desperate for this war. They got to have this war. The one thing that would screw them up is if we won't shoot first and give them the war.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people who are familiar with chess, if you're playing against someone and every time you move, you're moving because they did something and you're reacting to it, you're probably going to lose that game. You need to have the initiative. Having the initiative is so important. And that's exactly what you're talking about. And that is what Russia and China are doing. And you brought up a really good point. They are, they want to derail China. They want to stop its rise economically. And they know the only way to do that is war. Nothing else is going to work. They know war is the only way to do that, to create some sort of armed conflict where they can try to justify blockading China, collapsing the economy. Even if they collapse too, they feel like if they could do that, and then it'll be a race to see who can rebuild. That's what they're going for. And you're right. The best way to confound that strategy is to not fall into the trap in the first place. It is a trap. They're desperate to fight now while they still have a perceivable advantage. They know that in 5 or 10 years, that advantage is gone.
Exactly. And I've said all along, if you say, I got to fight you Thursday night, why? Well, because I'm having surgery. I'm going to get my leg cut off Friday morning. So I won't be able to fight you after that. I'll say, I'll wait till Saturday. If I know your weakness is coming, why would I fight you at your strength? It would be preposterous. I think China at this point will not be baited in. And what happens to me, what it looks to me is they just get more and more absurd. They just get more and more absurd in their attempts to bait China in. And right now, the last thing I'll ask you about is your thoughts on this banking crisis and where that's leading, what's going on with it. And I know neither of us are, well, I speak for me, I'm not an economist, but I do have a sister who's, she's a CPA, but she's run corporations and all that stuff. And she's pretty, she understands this stuff. And the problem is she explains it to me and I still don't know what the hell she's talking about. All I know is not a pretty sight. Your thoughts on the whole banking thing before we get, this will be the last question.
Well, I'm not an expert on finance and economics, but what I can say is I know what a real economy requires. You need to have industry, agriculture, and infrastructure, and these are all things that the West has neglected to the point because of their greed and their desire for power. They have been playing all of these games. Moving numbers around on ledger sheets. That's not economic output. It's like a pyramid scheme, and they were getting away with it because the U.S. had the reserve currency. It was linked to the what they call the petrodollar, and now you see them because they have abused this position that they hold in terms of financial leadership or being the dominant financial and economic power. They have completely abused it. They've abused it to the point where no one has any faith in it, and faith in a bank or in a system or in a currency is paramount to its success and its sustainment. And they have completely abused it, and people are searching out alternatives. That's what multipolarism is all about. It's about creating alternatives, real tangible alternatives for real things, industry, finance, everything. And people are leaving the US dollar. They have no faith in it. They saw the Swiss banks seizing assets because the US told them to seize Russian assets. Everyone else who's got money there are just wondering, when am I next? I could be next. Why am I going to keep my money in these banks? Their neutrality is gone. The trust is gone. I'm taking my money and going somewhere else. And this is going to play out all across the West's different, its financial institutions, the various systems that they were kind of running globally that people depended on, they're all being replaced. The way they went after Russia and the fact that China is next, and the fact that, look at almost any country on earth, their largest trade partner is China. They're all looking for exits. They don't like this. They don't want to be a part of this. They know that any one of them can be next, so they're looking for those alternatives. So that I think, I don't think it's a coincidence, the timing of these banking crises. They've had these problems. You know, in 2008 they had the big crisis. It's because they have created this artificial wealth. They're creating wealth out of nothing. It's not backed up by anything. And now you have alternatives that people can compare and contrast. You know, it's just like when the US and China, they go to Africa or Southeast Asia. China's offering tangible things that you could see, railways, ports, airports. They have all of these things that they can offer. The US is talking about, you know, programs, political programs, and things that are intangible. And it's when you're greedy and you're lazy, this is the kind of system you create, and it's unsustainable, especially if someone comes along with an alternative. So I think this is actually adding to the desperation, and this is an added incentive for the US to go after Russia and China, these nations that are offering this complete alternative. It's not just a different version of what the US created. It's completely different. It's tangible, real economics versus a gigantic pyramid scheme running out of control. So I think it's just going to get worse, because in order for the US to actually truly resolve its financial problems, it has to solve the fundamental problems. The fact that they don't have a real economy anymore, that their GDP is inflated. They're always talking about how big their GDP is versus, say, China or Russia. But when you look at industrial output, it tells a different story. Industrial output is what you use to physically change the world around you. The US just doesn't have that capability to scale that they used to. So I think it's just going to get worse, unfortunately.
I agree. Brian Berletic. And what's your channel again? Where can people find you online?
Just type in The New Atlas on YouTube, and then at the video description below each video, we'll have all the other places you can find and follow my work. And Garland, thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor and a pleasure, and it's always great to talk to people who get not only what's going on in Ukraine, but also understand the issue revolving around US-Chinese tensions. Usually people get one or the other, but not both. So it's great to talk to someone who gets both.
Well, thanks a lot. And The New Atlas, Brian Berletic. What is it? At Brian J. Berletic on Twitter? Is that it?
I don't know, because I had been kicked off of Twitter so many times and had to get back on. But the link will be in the video description below all of my YouTube videos. All
right. Thanks a lot. Good. The New Atlas. I never miss one. Everybody, make sure you become a subscriber. Thanks a lot, Brian. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye.
All right, everybody. Thanks a lot. That's Brian Berletic. Certainly appreciate it. Let's check out the super chats. Woo-hoo-hoo. We got a lot of people, not a lot of super chats, but people have questions. We'll try to answer them. All right. Not a lot, which will make it. Oh, there are super chats. All right. People may have questions. Cheers, Garland. Appreciate your work from an Aussie against the AUKUS. Thanks, Jane. That's what a great Australian name. Joseph Curry, thank you very much. We're looking for the super chats and possible questions or whatever people may have. Lasker Trees, thank you very much. We're looking through the super chats. Okay. Censorbot, I'm trying to praise humanity through Hezbollah. Interesting what's happening in the Middle East, isn't it? Paris is burning. I hope New York City is next. Nixon Door 24. Hey, I got a hat right beside me. Look at that. Look at this. Look at that. Nixon 2024. All right. Let's see here. Not a lot of questions this morning. Mark Shooten, thank you. Not a lot of questions. We got some super chats, but not a lot of questions. But if there are any, they shall ask and you will be answered. Got one letter says it all. Z. Okay. Z it is. Okay. Z. There we go. Another Z. Not a lot of other questions or anything else. That's fine. Oh, Maybe a question here. UA's completely lost. What's going on, sir? The people who are in charge, the neocons are in charge. We're going to Rockfin. There may be some questions on Rockfin. Scott Johnson, thank you. CAYK says, thank you. I think that's it. Wow, we got 150 people. Username, France is ready for its sixth republic. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. All righty. You all, thank you for giving me your time and hanging out with me and Brian on a Saturday morning. As you can see, if you can support the channel, go to patreon.com. If you can do $3, $5, $100 a month, whatever you can do is highly appreciated. Also, PayPal if you can, or buy me a coffee. I'm working on building a studio. That's what I'd like to do. Get away from this menial little desk and get this room turned into a studio. So if you can help do that, certainly appreciate that. If you can't, don't worry about it. Keep the money for you and your family. Cash App is an option. Last but not least, I'm on, make sure you like. I got 3,000 people. Make sure you give me 3,000 likes. Make sure you subscribe to my channel. If you're watching this on Twitter or elsewhere, please go to my YouTube channel and make sure you subscribe and click the little bell. Also, I'm on rockfin.com, ROKFIN, rockfin.com/Garland Nixon. You'll see all that stuff scrolling across the bottom of the screen. If you are able to support Rockfin, that's great. If not, you can just become a member. It doesn't cost anything. They don't have any advertisements. Rockfin.com/Garland Nixon. And there's no censorship. Check all over Rockfin. It's fantastic. It's a censorship-free, advertisement-free platform that gives you all the stuff that YouTube gives you for the most part. You can chat, all that kind of stuff. Rockfin, the way it does stay on, the way I keep my channel, the way it stays on, Rockfin does allow subscribers. If you can do that, it's $14.99 a month. You sign up for a year, it's only $12 a month. If you can afford to help the channel, help Rockfin, become a subscriber. I do one subscribers only show per week, which is Wednesday morning from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. with Scott Ritter. That's my subscriber only show that I do every week. But if you can't afford to be a subscriber, don't worry about it. Just become a member on Rockfin and you'll see all of my stuff with the exception of the one subscriber only show per week. Of course, thanks a lot. Follow me on all your social media platforms. Share this on all your social media platforms. Make sure, talking too long. Make sure you follow Brian Berletic. Peace. I'm out.